Europe is already under the Kremlin's crosshairs, but still lives in its own rosy illusions. Russia is not limiting itself to Ukraine. Its drones are flying over Poland, the Baltic countries, Germany, and even France. And the Shadow Fleet is testing the Baltic Sea for NATO's resilience. In fact, Russia has already started a war against the alliance. Mass violations of airspace and cyberattacks on logistical routes are not mistakes or coincidences. They are part of a large-scale hybrid war against the entire alliance. Europe hesitates, NATO fears provocations, and dictator Putin savors every weakness. What will happen next? Can the alliance contain Russia? Or will Europe silently allow Moscow to raise the stakes? And most importantly, how will this affect the war in Ukraine? Stay tuned. Mass violations of NATO countries' airspace are no longer pilot errors or lost drones. This is a campaign that Moscow is waging against all of Europe. The first unidentified reconnaissance devices appeared in the skies over Germany back in 2022, when they were spying on Bundeswehr bases and critical infrastructure sites. But the real wave of incursions began after Putin's meeting with Trump in Alaska in August 2025. Less than a month after that red carpet event in Anchorage, 19 Russian drones attacked Poland. Now drones are flying over Poland, Romania, the Baltic countries, Germany, and even France. NATO says there's nothing to worry about, but behind-the-scenes discussions tell a different story. Fear is growing. Sometimes it breaks out into the open, as in the case of Estonia, when 3 Russian MiG-31 circled over its skies for more than 12 minutes. But Estonia doesn't have its own fighter jets, only allies who once again advise it not to provoke the Kremlin and not to escalate the situation. But how much longer will NATO remain an alliance of the frightened? Secretary General Mark Rutte and Donald Trump have already stated that violators should be shot down. But will European countries have the courage to actually do this, as Turkey did in 2015? The Helsinki Security Forum showed that Europe is still living in illusions. While discussing the recent violation of Estonian airspace by 3 Russian fighter jets, European officials once again spoke about not provoking Moscow. The ambassador of Ukraine to Finland, Mikhailo Vidoinik, who was present in the hall, reacted rather critically, stating that such approaches seem more like naive children's games than a real strategy. The level of discussion only confirms this. Behind closed doors in Brussels, everything happens the same way. Expressions of diplomatic concern but no decisive action. Ukrainians wanted to hear a simple answer as to why Russian planes are still flying with impunity. European indecisiveness is becoming dangerous. Bilok reports that even after the direct violation of Estonian airspace, NATO still cannot determine whether it was a mistake. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is drawing its own conclusions. Putin knows perfectly well that an alliance country does not have sufficient means to effectively shoot down Russian drones. Western missiles cost millions, and that's clearly not a resource you can use to fight for long. Ukraine, however, cannot afford such hesitation. On March 27th, during a conversation with journalists, Volodymyr Zelensky said that 92 drones were flying toward Poland. Ukrainian forces destroyed them all over Ukrainian territory. 19 of them already made it in the direction of Poland. This means only one thing: Moscow continues to test the defenses not only of Ukraine but of all NATO. And here the main question is, how much longer will Europe spend worrying before it realizes that the war is already underway and it is not limited to Ukraine alone? There are 2 scenarios. To wait all the way until 2030, because let's face the truth, escalation is already happening. Western ministers and intelligence agencies predicted a year or 2 ago that the Kremlin was preparing for a large-scale confrontation with NATO in the second half of the next decade. But the events of recent months have shown that the Kremlin's timeline is much faster. Back in April 2025, military historian and professor at the University of Potsdam, Zen Kenetskel, warned in an interview with Deutsche Welle that this summer could be the last peaceful one for Europe. His prediction came true. By autumn, the threat became tangible not only for Ukraine but also for NATO countries. After the Russian drone attack on Poland, TS and UA journalists spoke with Professor Neitzel within the walls of the University of Potsdam. He outlined the most likely scenario for how events could unfold. Russia may launch a limited war against the Baltic countries or Poland. This refers to a scenario where Moscow seizes a small piece of territory and fortifies its position there, and waits for NATO's response. The most realistic threat vectors are narrow, strategically important areas. These include border towns like Narva and the critical Suwałki corridor, through which vital supply chains to the Baltic countries pass. For Moscow, these operations are not just a show of force, but a way to create facts on the ground, seize a patch of territory, fortify it, and wait for a response. This is exactly how supply lines can be blocked, logistics paralyzed, and the West forced to reckon with a new reality. Neitzel also emphasized the risk of escalation being fueled by threatening statements in the region, particularly claims about the delivery of advanced weapons to Belarus, which increases the likelihood of tactical blackmail. Then this forces us to look for answers now, not years from now. Ukraine is already experiencing these risks here and now, while Europe faces a choice: to keep talking about projected horizons, or to act so as not to let the Kremlin's scenarios fully unfold. Western analysts have repeatedly emphasized that real economic problems in Russia may begin in 2026. Even now, the resources of the National Welfare Fund are rapidly decreasing, and the Russian government has announced tax increases. In particular, VAT will rise from 20% to 22%. Falling oil prices and Ukraine's precise strikes on oil refineries only intensify the financial pressure on Moscow. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, speaking at the Warsaw Security Forum, emphasized that time is working against the Kremlin, as Russia is losing both economically and politically, failing to achieve success on the front lines. Donald Trump holds a similar view. After meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in New York, he compared the Russian economy to a paper tiger. However, assessments obtained by TSNUA from leading German experts indicate that the situation is not so clear-cut. According to a specialist from one of the key analytical centers that advises the German government, support from China and other partners allows Russia to continue the war for at least another 2 to 3 years, perhaps in a less intensive format. He draws attention to the risks associated with payments to contract soldiers and predicts that the Kremlin will likely have to resort to a second wave of mobilization, as it did in the fall of 2022. Against the backdrop of new challenges, including the appearance of unidentified drones in NATO airspace, European politicians are calling for decisive action. European Commissioner for Defense Andrius Kubilius has proposed creating an anti-drone wall on the alliance's eastern flank. However, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, during the same forum, made it clear that this project is not a top priority, emphasizing the need to invest in the rapid development of new systems. After all, technology is rapidly becoming obsolete, and at the same time, experts warn that the threat lies not only in drones over NATO countries. At the beginning of September, a vessel was detained in the Kiel Canal in Germany on suspicion of being used for espionage operations. Kubilius confirmed that the threat from Russia's shadow fleet is quite real. According to him, there is a suspicion that Moscow may use these vessels for covert drone launches from containers. Moreover, on September 28, President Zelensky already confirmed that Russia is using tankers to launch drones against European countries. The head of state added that it is necessary to strike painfully with sanctions against the entire infrastructure of Russia's tanker fleet. Russian propaganda is once again spreading its narratives. Lavrov accuses Ukraine, the EU, and NATO of waging war against Russia, while Zakharova fantasizes that Kyiv is allegedly preparing a conflict between Moscow and the alliance using repaired Russian drones. But experts have long warned that the real risk lies elsewhere. The Baltic Sea could turn into yet another theater of military operations. Moscow is already testing red lines. It is launching unidentified drones, violating NATO airspace with its fighter jets, and pursuing two objectives at once. The first is to intimidate Europeans and force them to reduce military aid to Ukraine. The second is to create a pretext for strikes on logistics routes for transporting weapons by rail and at airports. Cyberattacks on these systems are already taking place. The Baltic Sea, through which over 60% of Russian oil exports pass, has effectively become an arena of hybrid warfare. Let us recall how, in December 2024, a Russian ship fired signal rockets at a Bundeswehr helicopter. Or how the Russians constantly damage undersea cables and shamelessly escort their new fleet of tankers. In June, Moscow even sent a corvette and buoys with Oran missiles out to sea to cover the tankers. And when the Estonian Navy tried to stop the vessel, Russia sent Su-35 fighter jets there, which violated NATO airspace. Meanwhile, unidentified drones appeared over Denmark once again. right where the F-16s are based, which Copenhagen is transferring to Ukraine. Mikhailo Honchar, president of the Center for Globalistic Strategy 21, wrote on social media that Denmark and other countries in the Baltic region may respond asymmetrically. For example, by closing the straits to empty Russian tankers heading for loading. There are other signals as well. In July, it became known that Sweden, Denmark, and Germany plan to inspect Russian vessels and require them to provide insurance documents. Whether this scheme is currently working is unknown. European experts are also warning the Kremlin could go even further. They could mine the waters near Bornholm or Gotland, even in the riskiest scenarios. European NATO countries continue to rely on the United States, repeating we are not provoking Russia. At the same time, they admit the obvious. American troops are gradually leaving the continent. And despite all the public statements, the alliance still does not know how to proceed. Will Europeans have the courage to show strength to Moscow without Washington? And what do you think? How might events develop further? Write to us in the comments under this video. Stay with tsn.ua so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episodes.